morning. My name is Sabrina Gonzales, and I'm a psychology major. And my faculty mentor is Dr. Lisa Fournier. And the title of my presentation is Selective Attention and Anxiety, a research proposal. To begin, I will be referring to the construct of anxiety throughout the duration of my presentation. And anxiety is a psychological and physiological state of excessive worry or concern that can be expressed in various physical or cognitive symptoms such as sweating, tension, and although anxiety can arise without any discernible cause, normal levels of anxiety in response to sources of threat are healthy and are conducive for survival and efficient performance. But unrelenting anxiety has been associated with long-term negative effects on the body, and particularly when an individual becomes hypersensitive to potential sources of threat in the environment. Cognitive research has shown that anxious individuals tend to have attentional biases towards negative information compared to positive information or neutral information. And for example, Matthews, McLeod, and Tata used a probe detection task to measure attentional biases between anxious participants and non-anxious participants, and they used a task called the probe detection task. And in a probe detection task, two stimuli are presented on either side of a fixation cross, and about a third of the trials, a dot or a probe will replace one of the stimuli. Participants are instructed to respond as quickly as possible to the probe. So the reasoning behind, for instance, in a third of the trials, a probe would replace the word stupid. And so the reasoning behind this task is that the length that it takes a participant to find the probe or detect the probe reflects where their attention was located before the probe was presented. So if a participant was looking at the word couch and the probe replaced the word couch, it would take them less time to detect that probe than if it had replaced the word stupid, because they would have to look for it. And what Matthews and McLeod found was that their anxious participants were significantly faster at detecting probes which replaced negative words, and they interpreted this to show that the anxious participants were spending a significant amount of their time looking at the negative words compared to the neutral words. Another way that anxiety affects attention is through selective attention, and selective attention is the ability to attend to one source of information while ignoring irrelevant information around you. And this is important because selective attention allows for coherent thinking and coordinated behavior. The most common example of selective attention is known as the cocktail party effect, and that's the ability to pay attention to one conversation while a bunch of conversations are going on around you. We are biased towards different sources of information that will break our attention. So your name, if someone says your name, you're more likely to look away from a conversation that you're having. And anxious individuals are also have been found to be biased towards negative sources of information. So if we stick with the cocktail party example, and you're talking to a friend who happens to be relaxed and is generally not anxious, they happen to be engaged, but you're not really talking about that. You're talking about plans for a camping trip. And behind you, a conversation about another couple breaking up is happening, and the people are angry and steadily getting louder and using more confrontational words. But your friend is able to pay attention to what you're saying and is not easily distracted by the conversation. But if your friend happens to be anxious, they're more likely to have a difficult time paying attention to what you're saying because the conversation behind you is potentially threatening to them. So a way to measure selective attention is by using the Stroop task. And in the Stroop task, Color words are presented in incongruent font colors, and participants are instructed to ignore the meaning of the word and respond only to the color of the font. So if I could have a volunteer. Nikki, sorry, she got ya. Okay, so what you need to do is say the color of the font while ignoring the meaning of the word.
The color of the font?
Yes.
Red, green, yellow, brown, blue,
Yes.
purple.
Okay, so this task is actually a lot more difficult than it first appears, like if you're doing it in your head right now, and it's partly because reading tends to be a nearly automatic process, and it's very difficult to inhibit the meaning of the word. Another way that the Stroop task is used to measure selective attention is through a modification known as the emotional Stroop task. And in this version of the task, instead of using color words, emotional words are used. So as you can see on the screen, the word stupid would be presented in the color red, and participants would be instructed to respond to the color of the font while ignoring the meaning of the word. And Matthews and McLeod used the emotional Stroop task to measure attentional biases between anxious participants and non-anxious participants. And they used two types of words. They used either threat words or neutral words, and their threat words were comprised of words like, so stupid would be a social threat word, and a physical threat word could be something like fight. And they found that their anxious subjects were generally slower than controls in color naming all words, but they were particularly slow with the threat words. So this meant, they interpreted this to mean that the anxious participants struggled more when trying to ignore the emotional meaning of the word. And these results, Matthews and McLeod used a non-clinical sample of anxious participants. Okay, so another consideration when looking at emotional Stroop studies is using embodied cognition perspectives. And embodied cognition perspectives hold that our behavioral responses are evolutionarily tied with our cognitive processes. So our reflexes to get away from things that could harm us or to approach things that would be good or beneficial for our survival should be supported by our cognitive processes. And most often, you will find that outside of the lab, individuals are faster at getting away from things that are negative or could hurt them. So if a car is coming at you, you're more likely to try and get out of the way and quickly instead of slowing down, which is what the emotional Stroop studies have been finding. And to address these concerns, Chaju and colleagues, they suggested that perhaps the reason that there's a slowing down in response to negative words in emotional Stroop studies is because the behavioral responses do not reflect our natural behavioral tendencies. So by pushing a button or pressing a key, we're actually having participants approach stimuli that they would otherwise avoid in a normal context. To address this, they used an emotional Stroop study with negative words and positive words and had participants respond to the color of the font by either stepping forward or stepping back. And stepping forward would be considered an approach response, and stepping back would be an avoidance response. And what they found was that among their participants, all responses, avoidance responses, particularly to negative stimuli, were faster than responses to the neutral stimuli. So participants were faster at avoiding negative stimuli than they were at avoiding neutral stimuli. And this conflicts with the general tendency for participants to have slower reaction times to negative stimuli. So considering approach and avoidance reaction tendencies and also the previous findings with emotional Stroop studies leads to my purpose. And the purpose of my study is to see if anxiety has an impact on the ability to ignore irrelevant information while completing a task, and whether or not the emotional meaning of that irrelevant information has an impact on that ability. So if the information is negative or positive, does that have an impact on the ability to ignore that stimuli, and whether or not the type of response has an impact on the ability to ignore that information. So if we have an approach response, will that change whether or not a participant is able to ignore that information? So for my method, I will be recruiting participants through the the psychology department's online research portal, and participants will receive extra credit, 2 points of extra credit for participating in the task, which will comprise of 2 self-report measures and completing the task. I will be using the state trait anxiety inventory and the Beck depression inventory. And the state trait anxiety inventory is very commonly used among the emotional Stroop literature in both clinical and non-clinical samples. And it consists of 20 questions that ask about general coping methods with anxiety. And then I will also be using the Beck depression inventory, which measures the severity of depression in both non-clinical and clinical samples. And the use of both measures allows for one to act as a control, although I will be only using the state trait anxiety to separate groups of participants. The fact that depression and anxiety tend to be related or comorbid allows for one to act as a control. I will be using an emotional Stroop task, and like Chaju and colleagues, I will be using a different behavioral response. So I'm going to have participants respond by pushing or pulling a handlebar, and I'll have pictures shortly of that. And so my words will be presented in red or green, and red or green will be mapped to a specific push or pull response. And I will be using positively valenced words, so words with positive meaning, or negatively valenced words. And a lot of the studies kind of vary between, or go back and forth between using positive and neutral words. There tend not to be significant differences, or not as significant differences as negative compared to neutral, or negative compared to positive. And I have run some participants, and based on that data, I decided to use positive words because I felt it would align more with the approach and avoidance tendencies. Okay, so this is an example of what participants will see. So they'll start, this is a representation of the apparatus, and they'll see initiate trial page, and participants will control the pace through the study, which is something that a lot of studies are automatic, but I felt that this would allow participants enough time or the ability to recenter. You'll see a fixation cross which directs attention to the center of the screen. The fixation cross will be replaced by a stimulus, which will be either a positive or negative word in red or green. And so in this case, red is mapped as push, so a participant would be expected to execute a push response. And they'll receive feedback and then start again. And in this case, the participant would be expected to have a pull response. And so I'm going to counterbalance push and pull responses across all participants. So half of the participants will receive this mapping, and the other half will receive the mapping where a pull response would be indicated by red. And participants will also see all words an equal number of times in red or green, which ensures that they will have an equal number of push or pull responses. So fatigue shouldn't play a role, at least for one general direction. And this is a picture of my apparatus. It's a little unclear, but there are sensors on either side of the center of the apparatus, and there's a sensor here and a sensor here, and it's just a trigger. So when the bar presses against it, it records a time, and the distance for the push and pull responses are the same, and participants will need to sit up straight. And that's more to ensure that the task isn't any harder than it needs to be. And there's a foot pedal beneath the table that will allow participants to progress forward because their hands are taken. To reiterate, my main manipulations will be comparing high anxious participants towards low anxious participants. The valence of the stimuli, so whether they're positive or negative, and then the direction of the response, so whether it's a push or a pull response. So my predictions are that for the low anxious group, the reaction times should be very similar to Chaju and colleagues, in that all responses to negative stimuli should be significantly faster than responses to positive stimuli, but more importantly, that their push responses should be faster than their pull responses when responding to negative stimuli. For the high anxiety group, I expect that the participants' responses to negative stimuli should be significantly slower than responses to positive stimuli, and should be significantly slower in comparison to the low anxious group. And this aligns with most of the literature on embodied cognition, emotional Stroop studies, and anxiety, and Matthews and McLeod, like I mentioned before. And they're not quite even, but their responses to positive stimuli should be similar or equal to the responses of the low anxious group. And where the attentional bias to anxiety is most evident is in the differences between the push and pull responses to negative stimuli. So although the low anxious group does show this trend, the high anxious group has the degree of the difference is much greater. And this indicates that the high anxious participants are particularly attuned to the negative stimuli, and and that's why I concluded that they would probably be more efficient at responding at avoidance responses to negative stimuli. And then the attention bias is also evident in the how long it takes participants to respond depending on anxiety. So the high anxious group is much slower at responding to negative stimuli than the low anxious group. And then for my error rates, I don't really expect any differences, but if there are any, I would expect that responses, the greatest amount of errors would be for pull responses to negative stimuli, since all participants seem to be struggling the most with ignoring the emotional meaning of the word in that case. So when executing pull responses to negative stimuli, all of the participants are having the most difficulty ignoring the emotional meaning of the word. So for my implications, these results would support the existence of an anxiety-related attention bias, and that also approach and avoidance reactions should be considered when interpreting the reliability and validity of previous emotional Stroop studies, and should be considered when designing future studies. The fact that I have a push or pull response, there's distance, so I should be able to calculate speed, which is something that hasn't really been done before. And it could be the case that although anxious participants have slower response times in general, they may just be slower at executing initiating their response, but when they actually push or pull, they're pushing much faster or faster than the low anxious group. And the importance of the intentional bias and the impact on anxiety is that the ability to selectively attend to information is important for completing daily tasks or functioning on a general level, and understanding this attentional bias to negative information with anxiety may allow us to learn how to counteract or redirect this attention bias, or even capitalize on it when considering treatment or finding effective ways of coping with anxiety. And then I would like, that's it, thank you. And I'd like to thank my mentor, Dr. Lisa Fournier, for her time, and the psych department for their grant, which supported funding for my project, and the Ronald E. McNair post-baccalaureate program for allowing me the opportunity. So, any questions?
So explain again why high anxiety would be slower reaction time.
Because all of the literature has shown that the high anxious group has had a more difficult time ignoring the emotional meaning of the word. And so they have slower reaction times when responding to the negative stimuli. So, and so the pull response, because that's pulling something negative towards you, I would expect that it would align with, you're going to have a much harder time ignoring, so the anxious participants would have a harder time ignoring the emotional meaning of the word, and then they would have a harder time redirecting their response, because the initial response would be to want to get away, but they're having to correct themselves and then respond in the opposite direction of what they would normally intend to do. So.
you chose the colors red and green,
Mhm.
and I was just interested, like, why those colors? Like, do red colored items elicit more of an anxiety response than the green ones?
So the reason we're using red and green is not because of meaning for the color, because that would be another factor that I would have to consider, and we're counterbalancing them because a lot of participants will say like red means stop, green means go, so we'll make sure half of them will get that. But the reason we're picking them is because it looks the best on the computer screen, and participants, I can't use any colorblind participants, but they, if it's red or green, it's more easily visible on the screen. So.
So you test your participants for color blindness first?
Yes, when they come in, we have one of those Spellman charts or whatever it's called on the wall, and you get to check their vision and tell them, of course, that I'm not licensed and this is just a preliminary thing. So, and most of our participants tend to be female just because of the ratios in the department, so it doesn't come up very often that we have a colorblind participant.
So you mentioned that a lot of, I think it's high anxiety, people are trying to counteract their thoughts. So based on that, wouldn't you expect more error rates? But in your graph, you actually have the same error rates for both populations?
I have that like distributed for all of the participants in general. So I'm not really sure. I haven't really looked at the error rates, but generally for all participants, there are more error rates for negative stimuli than neutral or positive stimuli.
And do you plan to continue this research in the future?
I'm not sure, but I was thinking about other things that could be done with it, and since I considered reactivity, I thought maybe I could, if I was going to do this again after I finished, I might incorporate an anxiety sensitivity measure. And anxiety sensitivity measures more of how occupied a participant or how occupied an individual is with feeling anxious. So it's not so much that you're anxious, but that you're anxious about being anxious. So if your heart starts beating, you'll start thinking, oh my goodness, my heart's beating, something's wrong, things like that. So you could still be a relatively anxious person, but not be sensitive to it. And so I might incorporate an anxiety sensitivity measure to see if that had an impact or had different results than just general anxiety.
Out of curiosity, did you test yourself to see if you were anxious or not?
No, I didn't. I'm really familiar with the measure because I've used it in another lab. So anything that I would do on the thing, I would be like, well, I know I shouldn't answer that question. Or so it'd be biased for sure.
What was the hardest part about this whole research project for you?
So far, logistics, so things breaking. I've had a lot of, I've learned a lot about, so you spend a lot of time waiting and trying to figure out things to try and counteract that. I've made 2 apparatuses hoping to help with that, so patience and trying to figure out other ways to approach things is definitely